if you want to turn to Lamentations chapter 1. Lamentations chapter 1. Lamentations has 5 chapters, 154 verses, and 3,411 words. It's a small book, but man, is it packed full of truth. Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah, and it was written after Jeremiah was written. So Jeremiah was prophesying the coming captivity of Judah and Israel by Babylon. And in Lamentations, that captivity has taken place, and so now they're in the captivity. Basically, what happened in the captivity is that Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem, and what that means is that they came against Jerusalem, and what they did is they surrounded the city, and for 2.5 years, nothing came into the city and nothing went out of the city because Babylon was compressing everything, keeping everything out, keeping everything in. And so you can imagine a big city with a lot of people in it, where there wasn't a lot of ground to grow things. There weren't farms and those things within the city. That was all outside the city. And so food became scarce, and things got really, really bad. And eventually, after the weakness got so bad in town, then Babylon attacked, and it was really a brutal period of time for the nation of Judah in that time. Now, in Jeremiah, so here's the difference. In the book of Jeremiah, as you read Jeremiah, you see Jeremiah referring to Babylon and to Nebuchadnezzar 170 times by name. He just keeps saying Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, because he knew they were coming. He knew they were coming down. When you get to Lamentations, he never mentions Babylon, even though they were under captivity to Babylon. And he never mentions Nebuchadnezzar, even though Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. And the reason he doesn't is because Jeremiah began to realize something, that it wasn't Babylon that was coming down, but it was God that was allowing them to come down. And the fault of the attack on the city was not because of what Babylon was doing, but was because of what Judah had done. They'd forsaken God. And when you think about that, you know, we talk about how bad it is in America and what's going on, and how things are just a little bit haywire and crazy, and you can't keep up with anything, and you never know what's going to happen. Look, it's not the fault of it's really not government doing that when you really look at it, because the king's heart's in the hand of the Lord. And so what's happening is God is allowing some things to take place in our country and in our land. God is allowing some things to take place in our world, and our world has gone crazy because our world has turned their back on Him, and God has allowed the punishment to come that is coming, and so it became in Judah, it became the chastening hand of a loving God that was allowing Babylon to do what they were doing. And if you think about that, Hebrews chapter 12 says, "Whom the Lord loveth, He chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom He receiveth, And if you be without chastisement, then you're bastards and not sons. And basically what that says is if a believer, so-called, can live in sin without the chastening hand of God in their life, and without change occurring in their life, there's something wrong. Because you can't live outside the will of God without the chastening hand of God coming in your life, because God loves you that much. You know, when I was a kid, Mom and Dad never let me play in the middle of the road. And if I decided I wanted to play in the middle of the road, there was some punishment that was coming. Not because they hated me, but because they loved me. And God is that way with us. He chastens those whom He loves. And the nation, being God's nation and God's people that He chose, God would not allow them to continue to live in sin. Another thing that's interesting about the book of Lamentations, so the captivity, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the people and the temple was destroyed, it was on the 9th day of the 11th month. I just found this really kind of interesting. It was the 9th day of the 11th month. And even yet today, on the 9th day of Israel's calendar, the 9th day of the 11th month, Israel still has a day of remembrance about the temple falling back in 586, 587 BC, and they also commemorate the falling of the second temple in 70 AD after the death of Christ, when Rome destroyed the temple. They celebrate that day, or they remember that day, kind of like us. When you think about 9/11, you know, there are certain days that we remember and celebrate, or days of remembrance when we have just kind of a solemn day. December 7th is one of those days. The attack of Pearl Harbor, we remember that every year, and so that happened. In 1967, kind of interesting, and I've got this in the notes, you'll be able to look at it. In 1967, the federal government decided that we needed a number to call if there was an emergency that took place, and they finally decided that the idea wasn't a single number, but it needed to be 911, and so they instituted in 1968 911 as the emergency call number in America, and now that number is worldwide. What's interesting about that is that the Jews, when they, and in all Eastern cultures, when they put down a date, you know, we would say 11/9. If we were talking about November the 11th, we'd say 11/9. But in Eastern cultures, they put the day first and then the month, and so they said 9/11. And it's kind of interesting that when the terrorists attacked us, it was on the way they read the calendar, 9/11, which is 9/1. And I don't think the 911 was an accident. 911 as being the emergency call number. I think that all kind of corresponds together, and so the Jews still remember that to this day. Then if you go down a little bit in the notes, if you're following there, down where at the bottom of the page where it says acrostics and Lamentations. So if you look at the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, and chapter 5 all have 22 verses. Chapter 3 has 66 verses. And let me kind of give you in the original, in the Hebrew, when when the Hebrews would read this, you remember when we talked in Psalms 119 that Psalms 119 has 22 stanzas of 8 verses each, and those 22 stanzas of the 176 verses correspond with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and each one of those stanzas, like the first 8 verses, is Alph, A-L-P-H, however you say it, and then the second 8 words, or stanzas, or verses 9 to 16 was Beta, and it goes all the way through. And what happened is each one of those verses in that stanza in Psalms 110 to 119 in the Hebrew began with the Hebrew letter that stanza represents. That makes sense? So in Lamentations, in chapters 1, 2, and 4, it corresponds with that. What happens is when Jeremiah was writing Lamentations, each one of the verses in those chapters 1, 2, and 4 corresponds with the beginning word of that verse corresponds with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So verse 1 in chapter 1, verse 1 in chapter 2, verse 1 in chapter 4 all begin with the letter A in our alphabet, and then verse 2 starts with the letter B. The first word in that verse starts with the letter B, right on through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Then when you get to chapter 3, when you look at chapter 3, there are 66 verses. And basically what happens in chapter 3 in the Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 letters, and it's called a triple acrostic in the Hebrew writing in the beginning. And so there were 3 verses. Verse 1, 2, and 3 all began with the letter A. Verse 4, 5, and 6, the letter B, and then right on down through the Hebrew alphabet in those chapters. In that chapter, it's a triple acrostic, and it goes 22 times 3, so 3 verses for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. I just found that kind of interesting that that's the way Jeremiah wrote this book. That's the way God inspired him to write it. Chapter 5 leaves the acrostic form of the writing and just kind of lays it out as a prayer before God. Now, the 5 chapters represent the 5 divisions. If you go to the back page, and I'm going to come back to that center section because that's where I want to spend most of my time today. But if you go to the end of to the back of the page, the breakdown of the book is called Lamentations because Jeremiah is lamenting or grieving about certain conditions and about certain things. And the way that you can tell what he's talking about in that chapter is the first verse of the chapter. So if you look at chapter 1, it starts off and it says, "How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces. How has she become tributary?" So in chapter 1, he's lamenting or grieving about the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the city. In chapter 2, if you look at chapter 2 and verse number 1, he's lamenting the anger of God that's come against the people. "How hath the Lord covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger, and cast down from heaven unto the earth the beauty of Israel, and remembered not his footstool in the day of his anger." So Jeremiah is lamenting the anger of God. Let me just show you something. I told you a little bit ago that Jeremiah mentions Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon 170 times, and then Lamentations, Jeremiah doesn't mention them. He talks about the Lord. Look Look in chapter 1 and verse 15. He says, "The Lord hath trodden underfoot all my mighty men in the midst of me." Talking about Jerusalem. Look in chapter 2 and verse 2. "The Lord hath swallowed up all the inhabitants of Jacob." Verse 3. "He hath cut off in his fierce anger all the horn of Israel." Verse 4. "He hath bent his bow like an enemy." Verse 5. "The Lord was as an enemy. He swallowed up Israel." Verse 6. "He hath violently taken away his tabernacle." Verse 7. "The Lord hath cast off his altar." Verse 8. "The Lord hath proposed to destroy the wall of the daughters of Zion." Verse 11 or verse 17, "The Lord hath done that which he hath devised." Look at chapter 3. He says, "He hath led me and brought me into darkness." Verse number 3, He turned his hand against me." Verse 4, my flesh hath he made old. He hath broken my bones." So you can see, as you go through here, it's over and over and over again. It's God hath done this. God has done this. He hath done this. He hath done this, right? And so chapter 2, he talks about the anger of God. Chapter 3, Jeremiah laments his own affliction and sorrow. Verse number 1, "How hath the Lord covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger, and cast down from heaven upon the earth the beauty of Israel, and remember not his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up all the inhabitants." And Jeremiah then begins to, that's chapter 2, I'm sorry. Chapter 3, "I am the man that has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath." And so Jeremiah is lamenting his own sorrow. And in chapter 4, look at chapter 4, verse 1. "How has the gold become dim? How has the most fine gold changed? The stones of the sanctuary are poured out on the top of every street." Gold is a metal in the Bible that always refers to a king. Remember what happened? Solomon, the people brought gold to him, and in one place, it's kind of interesting, they brought 666 talents of gold to Solomon to celebrate his kingdom. When the wise men came to Bethlehem and found Christ as a young child, they brought gold, and that represented his kingship. And so what he's lamenting here is the end of the kingdom of Israel, which is the kingdom of heaven. We've talked about that. And in chapter 4, he does that. And then in chapter 5, Jeremiah begs God for a faithful remnant and the restoration of Israel. He's lamenting the fall, but asking God to remember. "Remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our reproach." So Christ and Jeremiah, we'll look at that, and then I want to go back to the Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Christ and Jeremiah, you remember when they came to Christ, and Jesus said in Matthew 16, he said, "Whom do men say that I am?" And they said, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, and some say you're Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." The reason they thought that Christ could have been Jeremiah, and that was a very specific reference to Jeremiah, is because of Jeremiah's heart. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And you remember Jesus came to Jerusalem, looked out over the city, and said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered you together as a hen would gather her chicks under her wings, and you would not." Christ wept over Jerusalem. And so Jeremiah represents Christ in this book. And then also, Christ is found in Lamentations. Look in chapter 3. And this is one of the most interesting, probably the most familiar verses in all of the book of Lamentations is Jeremiah 3:22. It is the Lord's mercies that we're not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. It's good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. He sitteth alone and keepeth silence, because he had borne it upon him. He putteth his mouth in the dust. If so be there may be hope. He giveth his cheek to him that smiteth him. He is filled full with reproach. We today in the morning service, I'm gonna. Heather called me last night, and whoever was supposed to sing can't sing for whatever reason, and she said, "Can you do the special tomorrow?" And I thought, "What in the world am I going to sing?" And I found out that Diane was going to be playing the piano today, and so I sent her a text last night and said, "Hey, can you play 'Great Is Thy Faithfulness'?" And it's because of this. In this verse, in these verses we just looked at, he said it's of the Lord's mercies that we're not consumed. And then he says a little bit further down, "Great is thy faithfulness." There was a fella that was born in Franklin, Kentucky. I didn't know there was a Franklin, Kentucky, but there is. Born in Franklin, Kentucky, which is just above, about 45 minutes north of Nashville, Tennessee. His name was Thomas Chisholm, Chislohem, I think is how you spell it. You can look it up and find it. Thomas Chisholm. He was born in 1866, and he got saved in his late 20s, was led to Christ by the guy that founded Asbury College down in Kentucky. He was led to Christ and was ordained as a preacher. And he only pastored one church for a short period of time, and then he got sick and he resigned the church. And but he moved to Winona Lake. You've all heard of Winona Lake, I'm sure, or at least could be. There's a fellowship of Christians that started a camp there, and he began to write poetry. And he wrote a poem, "Great is thy faithfulness." And he sent it later on. He sent that to the guy that was over the music department at Moody Bible Institute and asked him if he would consider putting it to music. And the fellow said, "Sure, I'll work on it." And when he read it, he thought, "Man, I need to make this music really good because this is a great poem." And this guy wrote 1,200 poems. 800 of them were published, this Chisholm guy. And so in the mid-40s, Billy Graham was holding a crusade in Great Britain, and George Beverly Shea heard this song and made it famous by singing at a revival meeting in England, "Great is thy faithfulness." And if you read that, the words of that song, it'll just touch you. I mean, what a powerful song it is, and became the second most requested hymn in all of Christianity. The first one kind of shocked me. "In the Garden" was the most requested hymn in Christianity, but the second most requested hymn is "Great is thy faithfulness." And he got that thought. And this was a guy that was raised in a log cabin, never had a day of schooling in his life, His mother taught him to read. He was teaching reading in school as a 16-year-old young man, became the editor of a newspaper, then got saved, and then began to write poetry. But here's the key. He figured out that God is faithful. And really the theme of Lamentations, when you boil it all down, is look, we have problems, but the problems that come in our life are many times the problems with our life, and that's why we have the problems that we have in our life, because God is trying to make us into what we need to be made. And in the midst of all of the trouble and the trials that we experience in life, God is faithful. Great is His faithfulness. Here's where I want to spend the rest of our time, though. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. Jeremiah 9:1 says, "Oh, that my head were waters and my eyes rivers of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughters or the daughter of my people." Jeremiah said, I wish that my head were full of water and my eyes could be rivers of tears flowing down my cheeks when I see what's fixing to happen in Jeremiah and then what did happen in the book of Lamentations, the captivity that was coming. Let me just show you some verses that go along with that in Jeremiah, or in mainly in Lamentations. Look at Lamentations 1 and verse number 2. Jeremiah writes about the tears, and there are several verses you could look at in Jeremiah, but Lamentations 1:2, he says, "She weepeth sore in the night, her tears are on her cheeks, all her lovers she hath none to comfort her, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her, they are become her enemies." The tears that were coming down in the nation because of their sin. Look at chapter 2. Go down to verse 11. Jeremiah says, "Mine eyes do fail with tears. My bowels are troubled. My liver is poured upon the earth for the destruction of the daughter of my people, because the children and the suckling swoon in the streets of the city." Look at verse number 18. "Their heart cried unto the Lord, O wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears run down like a river day and night." Look at chapter 3 and verse number 4. "My flesh," I think that's what I want. Oh, no, verse 48, I'm sorry. Down to verse 48. "Mine eye," Jeremiah says, "my eye runneth down with a river of water for the destruction of the daughter of my people. Mine eye trickleth down and ceaseth not without intermission." So Jeremiah was a man that was acquainted with grief and with tears. He spent a lot of time weeping about what was happening to the nation of Judah and to the people of God. And he knew that it was God that was doing it, and it was because of their sin. Jeremiah wept because of that. Look in Lamentations. Look in chapter 4. I got to find it. No, chapter 5, verse 11. It says there that when the Babylonians came down, it says they ravished the women in Zion and the maids in the cities of Judah. There was. You remember what happened on October 7th last year, right? When year before last, I guess now, when Hamas came into the border of Israel and they found women that were brutally raped and murdered. That kind of stuff was going on back in Jeremiah's day. They ravished the women. And they killed all of those people. And the number of people that were killed, they said it would be like if it was in America, when you take the population of Israel, what happened on October 7th, it would be like 30,000 Americans being killed. Look, Israel has not been not known for war. They've experienced war in their history, major war, since they become a nation 17 different times. I mean, they just keep getting attacked and keep getting attacked and keep getting attacked. But there has not been an attack like took place under Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. The women were ravished and raped, and the city was burned. And they took Jeconiah was the king that God said there won't be a man rule. But then after him, his son didn't become the king. When the Babylonians came in, the Babylonians set up Zedekiah as the king. So he wasn't the rightful heir to the throne and to the kingdom. Zedekiah was the brother of Jeconiah. And so he set him up kind of as a figurehead king. He really never really ruled Israel, but he was the figurehead. And when they captured him, what they did, and you can read about this in the book of Jeremiah, they sat him in a chair, they brought his kids in, and they let him see them kill every one of his kids. And then after they killed his kids in front of him with him watching, then they put his eyes out. Now, he was the king. They made him the king. That's the way they treated him. Let's just read that. Go back into Jeremiah chapter 39. I mean, we can't even imagine this kind of stuff taking place in our society, but this is what happened when the Babylonians came in. Look at verse number 4 of Jeremiah 39. It came to pass that when Zedekiah the king of Judah saw them and all the men of war, then they fled and went forth out of the city by night by way of the king's garden by the gate betwixt the two walls, and he went out the way of the plain. So when the Babylonians came in, all of them fled the city. But the Chaldeans' army pursued after them and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. And when they had taken him, they brought him up to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Riblah in the land of Hamath, where he gave judgment upon him. And the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes. Also before the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah. So the first thing he did is he killed all of his kids, and then he took all of the people that worked in, all the government officials that had been appointed under Zedekiah, and he killed all of them. And Zedekiah is watching all of this, and then in verse number 7, moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with chains to carry him to Babylon. I mean, the last thing he saw was his boys being killed, brutally slain. And they recognized him as the king. That's the way the Babylonians treated the captives of Israel. And so Jeremiah had reason to be known as the weeping prophet. He said, man, tears run down like rivers. I wish my head were waters and my eyes rivers. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about tears in the Bible, and I've got all of these verses listed in the last paragraph of that first page. Let me just give you a couple of them. Psalms 126, 5 and 6 says, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth forth in weeping, bearing precious seeds, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him." In verse chapter 30 of Psalms and verse 5 says, "Weeping may endure for the night, but joy cometh in the morning." Chapter 42 of Psalms and verse 3, "My tears have been my meat day and night." Psalms chapter 6 and verse 6, David talked about watering his couch with tears. Acts chapter 20, verse number 19, Paul talking to the Ephesians, the leaders of the Ephesian church, he said that he served the Lord among them with many tears. And then in verse 31, he warned them day and night for 3 years with tears. 2 Corinthians 2:4, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and he said when he wrote to them, he wrote to them with many tears. In Luke chapter 7, you remember Jesus was invited by Simon, not Simon Peter, but Simon the Pharisee, to his house to eat. And a woman came in with an alabaster box when she heard Jesus was in the house, and she broke the alabaster box of precious ointment and poured it on his feet. And then it says she washed his feet with her tears. Let me just ask you a question. We're living really in a very non-compassionate world. And what does it take? What do you weep about? You know, when you think about the condition of the church in the world today, and you want to know what the condition of the church in the world today is, go to Revelation chapter 3, the last part of that chapter, where he talks about Laodicea and rich and increasing goods and have need of nothing. And God said, "No, that's not you. You're poor, wretched, miserable, naked, and blind. You don't have anything." One of the popes said to Savonarola one time, he said, "The church can no longer say, 'Silver and gold have I none.'" And Savonarola said, "No, neither can she say, 'Rise, take up thy bed and walk.'" Just not any power in the majority of Christianity in our day. You weep about the condition of the church today. Does that bring tears to your eyes? Do you weep when you think about people that are lost and dying without Christ and are going to go to hell and spend eternity there? Have you ever really thought about what hell is? You know, we also say no tears in heaven. Well, that's not necessarily true. Because God said in Revelation chapter 21 that he would wipe all tears from our eyes, and he wipes tears from our eyes there, not here. And the reason there are tears there is because after the judgment seat of Christ, after the great white throne judgment, we'll be there. Listen, the judgment seat of Christ is for us to receive a reward. But the great white throne judgment is for the lost that rejected Christ. And God's going to take them that didn't receive Christ as their Savior and cast them into the lake of fire which burneth forever and ever, and their worm dieth not. Hell's a pretty horrible place. And we should weep now about those that are going to that place so we don't have to weep for them then. Because it's after that that we see the judgment of God upon the doomed and the damned that God wipes all tears from us. When you think about the Lord Jesus and how wonderful He is and how merciful He's been, does it cause you to weep tears of joy sometimes? See, you can tell a lot about a person's character. You can tell what people really care about by what causes a tear to come up in their eye. We can watch a stupid movie that's not real, just fake, just actors portraying something that's not real, and choke up and weep. But that which is real, we read, we hear, and we're unmoved. Jeremiah was moved by what moved God. And as I studied this book for the past about month, I couldn't get away from the fact of Jeremiah's weeping and brokenheartedness over what was happening to his people. And I began to think and to pray, God, would you break my heart over what breaks your heart? I read a story this week that really kind of reached out to me. Back in the 30s, there was a college group that were touring the homes of some of the great revival preachers back in the 1800s. And they ended up in England going into the home of John Wesley. John Wesley was wrong about some stuff. I mean, there were a lot of people that did some pretty astounding things that were wrong about some stuff. I read Wesley's life story one time. It's a book about that thick, and it's unbelievable the passion the guy had for souls. Said John Wesley preached over 3,000 times on "You must be born again." Somebody asked him one time, said, "Why in the world every time you preach on "You must be born again"?" And he said, "Because you must be born again." And they got to John Wesley's home, and they went into his bedroom, and they saw some marks beside his bed on the floor, about 18 inches apart. Somebody said, "What are those marks there on the floor?" The guy that was giving him a tour of the home said that's where John Wesley knelt and prayed every day that he was home for hours, that God would send revival to Britain and to America. They left that place and they went and they got back on the bus, and the teacher was counting the students, and he looked around and he saw someone was missing, and so he went back in the house and he found one of his students knelt in the same place that Wesley had knelt all those years before and prayed for revival. And this young man was praying, God, will you do it again? Do it again, Lord. That young man's name was Billy Graham. He preached to over 3 billion people and had over 2 million people saved under his ministry. Oh, that God would give us hearts to have him do it again. That we would have a heart like Jeremiah to weep over the slain of the daughters of God. Let's pray, okay? Father, I love you. I thank you for all you do. God, I pray that you would give us the spirit of Jeremiah. I remember years ago, first time I heard Brother Travis Hudson preach, pray, God, will you give me the heart of Jeremiah? God, I pray you give that to us today. May what breaks the heart of God break our heart. Lord, I pray that you do again what you did in the days of Wesley, Whitfield, Knox, Moody, all of those great men of the past. Would you do it again? Give us the heart that they had. May it begin today in our church. In Christ's name.